In this video, we're going to be talking about place value of decimals. And there are 5 teaks that we're going to work with place value of decimals at this point in the year. 4.2a, 4.2b, we have already done with place value of whole numbers. So now we are just extending our understanding of what we know about the place value chart and the base 10 system, and now we're working specifically with decimals at this point. 4.2e talks about representing decimals using concrete and visual models in money, and 4.2f talks about comparing and ordering decimals using concrete and visual models to the hundreds. So I just want to look at those 4 teaks right now, and then we'll come back to 4.2h. All right, I want to go over some things that we have already talked about with whole numbers. Of course, I may want to go back and have students work with the actual place value chart and have them understand that everything in front of the decimal is, or to the left of the decimal, is a whole number, and anything to the right of the decimal is a part of numbers. I could use those place value cards on a place value chart to practice reading numbers and writing numbers in standard form. I could also go through and use the place value pockets like we talked about earlier with whole numbers, but now I'm going to include the tenths and the hundredths as well. Remember, with these I can have students create the number in standard form when I call it out. I can have students practicing reading numbers. I can have students creating numbers and comparing and ordering numbers with partners or in groups. So I can use that. When we talk about representing decimals with concrete models, I can always go back to base 10. Now this is sometimes hard for students to see, and you could actually do it like this. See if I can fit all this on my mat. You could actually do it like this. And you could talk about how this is a whole. One whole. Okay? And then this rod represents a tenth of the whole. And to help kids understand what a tenth means, you talk to them about how many of these does it take to make one whole. And once again, we talked about this is our times 10 relationship of that base 10 system, correct? So when we talk about that, it's also sometimes helpful for you to talk about this as 10 cents. Okay, that this is 10 cents. So think about how many dimes does it take to make one whole dollar. Okay, and it is part of your teaks that you talk about money. They use money to represent decimals as well. Okay, then we can talk about our hundredths, and we're going to talk about what that means. It takes 100 of these to make a whole, or it takes 10 of these to make a tenth. And once again, we can relate it back to money. Okay? From there, we can talk to students about how to read this decimal. It's 2 and 15 hundredths. So it's like I have one whole row of these and then 5 ones. Okay? So as far as concrete models go, we can always go back to base 10 blocks. If we're going to work with the visual models, those are our tenth squares and our hundredth squares. Okay, so students can practice, if you call out a decimal like 15 hundredths, they can shade that in. Same thing for this. If you call out a decimal such as 2 tenths, they can shade that in to represent those decimals visually or pictorially. Okay. All right, comparing and ordering decimals. We're going to do exactly like we did with whole numbers. Our strategy for all decimal questions besides number lines and relating decimals to fractions is anything with place value of decimals, we are going to use that place value chart. That is our strategy. Same thing with when I compare and order decimals. Now, when comparing and ordering decimals, they always give them a pictorial model to use. It is up to you, the teacher, if you want to have students use that model or not. Sometimes I find it helpful, sometimes it's not helpful for students. But on the problem like you see here, I would most definitely have kids label each of these models, and then from there I would have them place it in that place value chart, just like we talked about with whole numbers. Okay, so I would have them fill it out here. I would compare and order just like I did with whole numbers. We're going to list them all, have them use the index card, determine which is on this one greatest to least. We're going to have them do their circling, listing them, pulling them out, and so forth. Okay? So same exact strategies as whole numbers. That is important because students need to know that there's not a separate strategy. It is all the same strategy for them. I forgot to mention as well, when students are writing decimals in expanded notation, we're going to do that the exact same way we did whole numbers as well. It's all the same. So, for instance, let's say I want to write 2 34/100 in expanded notation. So, remember what we did before, is you're either going to use strips of paper, you can use place value discs, but as I said, if you don't have those, strips of paper works great. So we have 2 wholes, we have 3/10, and we have 4/100. If you don't have these, as I said, pieces of paper, you can have students just write in the values. All right, so to write our expanded notation, 2 times, I have 2 ones, so 2 times 1, plus I have 3 times 1/10 plus 4 times 100. Okay, so just like it did with whole numbers, we're just going to extend that same idea to do an expanded notation of decimals. All right, so the last thing that we're going to talk about with decimals, and the only thing that's really kind of new for with decimals that we didn't do with whole numbers before, is look at it as far as number lines. So, on your instructional talk page, it says with number lines, what is important is to have students find the interval. The students need to label the entire number line, and then they need to identify the value of the point. Okay, so let's pretend this is our number line, and I want to know this point here. We'll just label it A. So I need to decide whether this is a 100th number line or a 10th number line. Well, when I look at it, and I look at the decimal behind my whole number, it is all in tenths. So that can be my first try. So I label it 2 2/10, 2 3/10, 2 4/10, 2 5/10, 2 6/10, 2 7/10, 2 8/10, 2 9/10, and then 3. So yes, it is, the interval is going up by tenths. Now, I did have these two numbers that were right next to each other. We call them the number neighbors. So I could have easily looked at what is the difference between 2 and 4/10 and 2 and 5/10 and saw that I was going it by tenths as well. So once I've identified the interval, labeled the number line, I can very easily see which point that I am looking for. Alright, so when I'm looking for decimal number lines, I want to make sure that I'm doing both horizontal and vertical number lines. This is a problem that was on the 2016 release STAR test. And it caught a lot of students off guard because they were used to seeing number lines that were only horizontal. So we want to make sure that they are also seeing vertical number lines as well, that you're practicing those with students, okay? And as you see here, they don't give them a whole lot of labeled lines, but once again, they would have to understand that, and by this point they've had fractions, so they could look at this and say that it was split up into 10 equal parts. But the main thing for them to do is to identify the interval. Alright, and finally, before I move on, I'm going to talk about money. Make sure that all the problems that you are doing with students include them looking at money, whether it is getting a handful of play money out of a bag and writing the money and putting that amount on the place value chart, whether you give them a group of money and ask them what digit would be in the tenths place, what digit would be in the hundredths place, what digit would be in the ones place. They need to have activities with money as well, not just by looking at it with a hundredths or a tenths grid. So make sure you include that as well. Okay, I think that is all that I want to say about decimals right now. The next thing we're going to talk about with decimals is adding and subtracting decimals. We'll talk about that in a future video. Please take a look at that instructional talk page and let us know if you have any questions.